Hi. I played the second round of the George O'Rourke Memorial last night in Fitchburg, and I had the black pieces on board 1 against Ralph McNeilage, who's rated 1774. He played c4, I played knight f6, he played knight c3, and I played g6. And after his d4, we've transposed into a queen-pawn opening, which surprised me because I'm not used to seeing that from players who lead with c4. Bishop to g7, e4, castle kingside, and knight f3, and after my d6 we've landed in a position that's headed for the mainline King's Indian defense. Bishop to e2. And normal here for black, I think, or most common, is probably this move e5, but I decided to derail things a little bit and head toward a Benoni pawn structure with c5. White played d5, which is of course a good move, and I played e6, attacking his center. It's critical in these hypermodern openings to find a way to break down your opponent's pawn center. If you don't do that, eventually the opponent's pieces are built up strongly enough behind that pawn center that you can't anymore. And from that point on, you're just hoping he doesn't find a way to play a pawn break advantageously and use his space to win the game. Bishop to g5 from white. And now if I take on d5, there's a little bit of a concern that he may take back with his knight, of course, and put pressure on this knight on f6 and create a target on d6. So I decided to play h6 first. And Ralph retreated all the way to d2, which I think we sort of agreed after the game was maybe not the right idea. Pretty much any other bishop move here should be superior to that. The problem with bishop to d2 is it blocks white's control of the d-file with the queen. And when my knight comes to e4 later, as it does in this game, it's going to be threatening that bishop. E takes d5. I was expecting c takes d5, which would give us kind of a normal-looking modern Benoni pawn structure, but there's nothing wrong with e takes d5. And here, I during the game was thinking that I had to make a choice. A major goal for black in the Benoni is to trade a couple pairs of minor pieces. And I was thinking about two ideas. One was to go bishop g4 and take on f3. Another is to go rook e8, knight e4, at which point I'm likely going to trade for the knight on c3. And I thought that I could only do one or the other. So I thought that after bishop g4, if white plays h3, I was taking on f3, and then even if I play rook e8, I can't play knight e4, but it's pretty clear to me here that rook e8 check is a nice move for black. So I don't know what I did here, I guess just miscalculated. But I thought I had to choose between these two ideas, so I decided to play rook e8 and then knight e4. Ralph played h3, stopping bishop g4, which I think was a good move, and I played knight e4. And I think the way for white to go here is knight takes e4, rook takes e4, castle kingside, after which he'll play bishop d3, and white has an advantage because of his extra space, but at least black has traded one pair of minors. But Ralph instead castled right away, which allows me to grab this bishop on d2 if I want to. And since a big plus in the Benoni is this g7 bishop for black, and since bishops tend to become more powerful when their counterparts are removed, I jumped at the opportunity to play knight takes d2. But it's possible that either knight takes c3 or bishop takes c3 is also a good move. He played queen takes d2. Okay, so now this bishop on g7 doesn't have a bishop opposing it on the other side, and it's very powerful on this diagonal. But black has a big problem in that every other piece is on the back rank. And while that's okay for the rook on e8 and to a certain extent for the queen on d8, the queenside pieces will have to be developed for black to be okay here. So I played knight d7, intending knight e5. Ralph played rook fe1. And I played knight to e5. And here we have what's probably going to be the second trade of minor pieces. Though after Ralph's knight takes e5, I couldn't really make this move bishop takes e5 work. Let me show you what I was looking at. I wanted to play bishop takes e5 as a pawn sacrifice, and after queen takes h6, queen f6. And now I've got a couple ideas. The biggest one is bishop to f4, which would be a queen trap. Another is to take a couple times on c3, and a third is to put pressure on the f2 square. The problem, though, is that white could have played bishop d3 here, and this rook on e8, because it's undefended, requires of black that he spend an extra move doing something like bishop d7. And then the queen can come back, and I'm not sure that I'm actually going to achieve anything with my two bishops and my activity, which should mean that I don't have compensation for the pawn, and therefore that white has a significant advantage here. So I played rook takes e5 instead. Ralph played bishop to d3, which is a good move, activates the bishop, allows his rooks to take control of the e-file. And wanting to be able to retake on e5 with my bishop, I played king h7. And I think here is an opportunity for white to improve. He played rook takes e5, but that wasn't really the move I was worried about. I think after rook e5, bishop e5, this bishop is just really nice for black. And it's looking like black will have time to develop the rest of the pieces. What I was more concerned about was queen f4, hitting this pawn on f7. But I think I figured out that here black has time to play bishop f5. And he doesn't end up losing a pawn or getting an obliterated pawn structure, because after rook takes e5, bishop takes e5, white doesn't have time to take on f5. He has to move the queen away. And after bishop takes f5, rook takes f5, that move comes with tempo, of course, and if necessary, the rook can move back to e5 on the following move. But it might instead team up with the bishop against f2, maybe with the queen's support. So I was thinking I'd probably be okay, or even better here. But after rook takes e5 is in the game, bishop takes e5. This bishop's really strong. Black has the two bishops. White has lost the f4 square. Yeah, I think this just kind of has to be at least a little bit better for black. Rook e1 from Ralph. And it's good to have an eye for when the opponent's king doesn't have very many defenders, as in this position, especially when there isn't a defensive knight on the f-file, on the first or third f-file square. It opens up access to the h4 square, to the g5 square, to having pieces on e5 and d4. So I played queen h4 with the idea that there may be a sacrifice here that leads to the win of material or to checkmate. In fact, if we just make kind of a passing move for white here, black can probably play bishop takes h3, g takes h3, queen takes h3, and if f4 to try to stop anything on h2, there's bishop d4 instead, and white's losing his queen. And if not, there's bishop h2 check, king h1, bishop f4 check, followed by bishop takes d2. But of course, Ralph didn't play a3. In fact, I think he found a really nice move here, and an especially nice follow-up. He played rook e4, and I retreated my queen to f6 now that his knight's not coming to e4, at least for now. And I was very surprised by his next move, because I hadn't even considered it, and when I saw it, I thought it was a blunder. He played g3. In general, it's not a good idea to move the pawns in front of your king, especially when you don't have very many defenders over there, and especially when it leaves a pawn hanging. So my first thought was, oh, I can play bishop takes h3. But of course then white would play rook h4 with a fork of my bishop on h3 and the pawn on h6. So it's not possible to capture, but there's more to this move than the fact that the h-pawn is not actually hanging, because the g3 pawn is now guarding h4 and f4, taking f4 away from my bishop and securing h4 for the white rook. I really like this move. I thought about it for a while, and eventually decided that bishop f5 looked like it could be played, so I did, because I needed to develop my pieces, and this bishop's not a bad piece with all the pressure it's putting on my king's side, so I might like to trade it off. Of course, Ralph's natural potential tactical shot here is rook h4, with the idea that after I take on d3, he can take on h6. But I think it turns out that he can't actually take on h6 here. Rook takes h6 check, king g7, and there can't be a recapture on d3 or the rook will be lost on h6. And if queen takes h6, king g8, queen h7 check, king f8, white can't play queen h8 because that square is covered twice by the black pieces, and there's now no way to retake the bishop on d3. So Ralph recaptured on d3 with his queen. And here, I guess, was a major crossroads for me, and it's the type of decision that I have to be able to make better if I want to be a better chess player. I thought of 3 ideas here, but couldn't make up my mind about which one I wanted to go for. One idea is to take on c3 when, for example, if queen takes c3, queen takes c3, b takes c3, rook e8, black threatens to invade on the e-file and start winning pawns, and if the rook gets down there to e2, white won't be able to save these disconnected queenside pawns. So it's tempting to play king f1, but then there's this move g5 when rook g4 hangs a rook to f5, so white would have to play rook h5, and then after king g6 he'd have to play g4, and obviously white's in big trouble with his only piece completely cut off from the rest of the board. So this looked good. And after b takes c3, rook e8, I was a little bit worried about the move rook e4 from white, until I spotted queen f5, which looked decent to me, because, of course, rook takes e8 is not check, so it would hang the queen on d3. I'm also attacking, excuse me, the pawn on h3, so I thought I would get some kind of an advantage from here. But right before I played this move, bishop takes c3, I saw the disgusting-looking rook f4, threatening my queen, and then threatening the lightly defended f7 pawn behind it. I might be tempted to play a move like queen g7, which defends this pawn on f7, but then, for example, after queen takes c3, if we go down that same line, queen takes c3, b takes c3, I don't have time for rook e8 because a rook takes f7 check and rook takes b7, so I have to play king g7, but then after rook e4, it's white who's in charge. So I rejected bishop takes c3, and I had 2 other ideas. I'm not sure I chose the right one of them. I'm not even sure there is all that good a move here for black, although I'm convinced that because this bishop is so good, there ought to be a good move here. I was looking at queen g7 and queen f5. Queen g7 has the idea to now or later take this this e4 square away from the white knight and the white rook and the white queen with f5. And afterwards I'd have to find some way to slowly build up my heavy pieces and maybe try to take over the e-file and go after the white king. But whenever I move my f-file, my f-pawn off of the 7th rank, I get nervous about the exposure of my king. So it's not uncommon for me to play something else if I can find it. And that's why I played queen f5. A strange looking move, but the idea is that if white trades queens, as he did in the game, after g takes f5, the e4 square has been denied to the white pieces in a different way. I think here Ralph probably should have put something on e4, knight e4, or bring the rook back to the center, rook e4. The game would have gone on from there, obviously. Oh, I'm sorry, rook e4 may just hang this pawn on h3. Okay, so maybe knight e4 and then bring the king up to to g2, or bring the king up to g2 right away, and then maybe go rook e4. What am I talking about? The queen's hanging on d3. Alright, let's put some actual thought into this. So the queen's hanging. If the rook moves back, the pawn on h3 is hanging. So maybe did this temporary self-pin with knight e4. And then perhaps king g2, maybe queen f3 after that. Try to get the rook back into the game. Now that I look at this, maybe it's looking kind of scary, because there are going to be variations in which this rook on h4 gets trapped. Okay, so maybe Ralph did the right thing here in taking on f5. But it leads to a position in which, at least after his next move, rook h5, we end up with a position in which black has a significant advantage. So maybe there can be an improvement found here. Ralph played rook h5, king g6, defending my f-pawn and attacking the rook. Of course, now he has to play g4. Otherwise, what was the point of rook h5? But after f takes g4, h takes g4, bishop takes c3, b takes c3, rook e8, a fork is threatened on e4 of the g4 and c4 pawns, and if those are defended with f3, there's a different fork on e3. So white, I think, is in serious trouble here. It's a good thing to be on the lookout for this kind of thing in a chess game. You'll have opportunities over the course of the late middle game to trade some pieces and end up in an endgame. And if you can figure out whether or not that endgame is good for you, it will make a big difference to your record in these games. So rook e8. Ralph defended with rook h3, which doesn't defend the pawns, but I mean, there's not really anything white can do here. Rook e4. Ralph went for counterplay, which is generally a great idea in a rook endgame. The only issue here is that black's going to take so many pawns that white's rook activity doesn't really achieve what white needs it to achieve. It doesn't give enough counterplay. I played rook takes g4 check, king f1, rook takes c4, rook e7, rook takes c3. So black's up 3 pawns in the current position and 2 pawns if white takes one back right now. If rook takes b7, I mean, maybe rook d3, taking this pawn is the way to go, or rook to a3, trying to force rook b2, and then coming back to d3 and grabbing this pawn. Instead, Ralph went after my d-pawn, which makes a lot of sense. He needs counterplay, and he's going to take this pawn with check, and once he takes it, his d-pawn will be passed. Rook c2, going after the a-pawn, rook takes d6, king g7. Probably possible to come over after the e-pawn, but why hang the pawn on h6, and why end up in a situation in which my king might end up unable to come back and defend against the queening of the d-pawn. So king g7, king e1, rook takes a2, rook d8, rook a4, intending to get behind white's passed pawn, d6, rook d4, rook d7. Of course, I'm happy to trade one of these queenside pawns for the d-pawn, at which point there isn't any counterplay for white. So b5, Ralph went rook b7 instead of taking on a7, rook takes d6, rook takes b5, and I have to agree with his implicit argument that a and c pawns aren't as good for black as b and c pawns. But I get behind my pawn with rook c6, and after king d2, c4, king c3, white can never take this pawn, as that would result in a rook trade, after which black's extra pawns would win the game. Rook c7, just kind of defending the a-pawn. f4, king g6, intending to play f5 and then try to come around and get rid of this f-pawn, or just play f5 and then throw the h-pawn down the board. Rook d5, f5, rook d6 check, king h5. Rook f6 is a double attack. I guess I could defend the f-pawn with rook c5, but I thought, why not just play king g4, rook takes h6, king takes f4. Rook h4 check, king g3, rook h8, f4. Now this pawn's going to march up the board, and once that happens, all black will need to do is shield the black king from checks, and that pawn will queen. Rook g8 check, king f2, rook f8, f3, rook e8, and a little bit of an inaccuracy here from me. I guess I was assuming that the white rook would still be on the f file. But of course I can just play king f1 here because the f pawn's not being threatened. I played king g2, rook g8 check, then king f1, rook f8, f2, rook e8. And I think what black should do here is just play rook g7, king g2, f1 queen. But I got fancy, which is usually not a good idea, but is okay here because black has so much extra material. The idea is just to establish a Lucena position with the rook coming to shield the black king from checks once it's on the f4 square. Have I been naming the squares wrong all game? I hope not. Okay, and I don't think a move here from white like king d4 or king b4 attacking the rook is going to help white out very much because they have c3 anyway, and after he grabs the rook c2, this pawn can't be stopped from queening. So Ruff played rook f8, I played king e2, rook e8 check, king f3, rook f8 check, king e3, rook e8 check, king f4. And here, in light of the fact that rook f8 check is responded to with rook f5, Ralph resigned. Alright, so that's round 2. I will be back next Thursday with round 3, and for those of you who are interested, I'm posting a new rapid chess video every Monday. Thanks a lot.